Up until a few years ago, the human masses had little control over the content we load into our consciousness program. The old hierarchical information distribution system, where a few tell the many what is, has given way to a much flatter system where anyone can be a consumer or a publisher of content. Quite frankly, this new information distribution model, the internet, has allowed today to happen. A few months ago, I happened upon a podcast and heard this brilliant guy talking about a topic I'd heard before, but with a new compelling twist that was relevant for today and the consciousness stuff I'd been so focused on. So we can thank the internet for enabling our gathering here in Port Austin's new visitor center. We're in for an exciting day with lots of good stuff. Please join me in welcoming Gerald Clark to discuss his breakthrough book, The Anunnaki of Nibiru, Mankind's Creators, Enslavers, Destroyers, Saviors, and Hidden Architects of the New World Order.
So, today we're going to talk about the Anunnaki of Nibiru, mankind's forgotten creators, enslavers, destroyers, saviors, and hidden architects of the New World Order. It's a long title, but I wanted to get that in there because it really differentiates my book from where other people have gone. And a lot of people have talked about the Anunnaki. How many people have heard about the Anunnaki before? Several. Okay, so there's a lot of people here that know. How many have actually never heard of the Anunnaki? Really? Raise your hand, I want to know. No, but just one. Wow, that's amazing. Two. So the Ancient Alien series on the History Channel started in 2009. I started this research in 2002, and nobody had heard about it. We didn't talk about this kind of stuff until that series from the History Channel really changed everything as far as I'm concerned. And we're kind of catching a marketing wave. So what are we going to talk about today? Something that comes up, hopefully. What's going on there, honey? Okay. So this first section today, we're going to talk about human consciousness. And I'm going to try and tie in how the Anunnaki fit in with that in the second part. So today, we'll talk about awareness, thought consciousness, and structural integration. And I'll define some of these terms for you. But in the first slide, we'll talk about man's search for meaning. This is where the concept that Dr. Viktor Frankl brought up. And it was a very, very moving book. He went through a terrible experience, but what he learned from that I want to share with you. We'll talk about who we are, where we originate, the creation account, which one is applicable, and the one that we're going to talk about today, the current state of humankind, and this informational change that's happened now that the playing field has been leveled. And a lot of people want to know this. If there really were creators, where are they today? Okay. Okay. I'm going to cover a lot this morning, so I'll try to do it quickly. I'll cover quickly a little biographic information on myself, some of the religious predispositions that I was exposed to as I came to wrestle with this knowledge, some of the Sumerian records that I got turned on to, and how my son with a genetic disorder fits into all this. Some of the definitions we're going to talk about. In that first segment, Scott brought up on physics. He mentioned consciousness and spirit, energy, and power. I want to define those so we can be on a common playing field as we go through and how these terms relate to us in our energy body. And then the last one that was really profound for me, and I probably am one of the only people in this Anunnaki story that are approaching it from this standpoint. I don't know anybody else that's told that story from a structure standpoint. It's very powerful to me, and I'm going to share that with you. Okay. I don't know why this thing's not working. Some of the topics we're going to discuss. Human energy, probably the most important, and all the different aspects of it. Energy, spirit, and consciousness. Some of the concepts from Asia about quantizing our energy body. We'll talk about perception and archetypes and some of the DNA coding that was talked about by even seminal researchers like Timothy Leary in the 60s were discussing this. The relationship between consciousness and thoughts. If the belief manifests our reality, then the thoughts are the basis of that, so we've got to talk about those. Thinking behavior, thinking in the now. How many people have read Eckhart Tolle's book, Power of Now? A couple, okay. Very profound book, and we're going to define what that means, the now. It's very much related to consciousness. Brainwave segmentation and functional mapping. And then we'll talk about the interaction of energy and matter. I'm an electrical engineer, and I'll talk about that. So the interaction of energy and matter, that was everything to me. Especially this matter, which I'd never considered. the electromagnetic spectrum and what extreme low frequency can do to affect your brainwave segments. The extreme low frequency and entrainment, what you listen to can have an effect on your brainwaves. And then this model ultimately leads to what I call the human antenna model. Okay. And then finally, before lunch, we'll finish up with this how structure, the human structure affects your energy and the human antenna. And we'll talk a little bit about the human structure and how you can change that. It's very malleable. I have an equation for maximizing it for those that are more scientifically bent. And we actually have tools that I didn't bring with me for measuring and visualizing the human energy body. A little more math, some limit equations, and the implications that Ida Rolf stated about energy and your structure. So this has to do with gravity, and we'll maybe possibly get into defining that. And I might ask some of you to define what you think gravity is, because once you get your arms around that, SI will make a lot more sense. And then Krista actually went through some of this training, and we are going to share some of her before and after pictures. Okay? Let me see if I can get this thing working. Maybe I got to point it at the thing. Oh, there. It worked. Okay. And then in the afternoon session, we'll talk about civilization's origins, some ancient structures, evidence for language. That's where I started. Everybody's lighting up on the afternoon session. This is really, to me, what my book was about. The consciousness stuff, I've always been on that path, and luckily I wove it in the book to the point where Scott picked up on that. So I'm happy we're doing that as well. This is the first time I've actually got a full session where I can talk about consciousness. So we'll look at a geographic map to kind of get you in the space of where all this went down. There's an approach plate. I was a pilot in my past, so when I saw an approach plate to a possible landing site with VOR approaches and such, it made sense to me, and I'll share that with you as well. Some of the pre-diluvial cities along the Tigris and the Euphrates that were involved in this story. And then I brought a genealogy table. I tried to digitize it to make it viewable. It's very difficult to do that on something that long. So I actually brought the original. I'm going to pass it around so you guys can see it. Okay. From that, I have a God table that involves who they were and what cultures they were operating in. And I think you'll recognize some of the names. In 3760 BCE, we'll talk about the council and how it was composed and how that affected our calendar systems. And then we'll go deep into 4 different aspects of the evidence of the Anunnaki on Earth: the astrological, we'll do biological, we'll do genetic, and documentary. Go ahead. And there's a couple of press reports from way back in '86 as well, '83 and '86. And then about the time your food coma kicks in after lunch, we'll be on the real heavy stuff: mankind's first writing, some documentary evidence, some tablets. We'll talk about Enki and who that is, some of the documents from the Sumerian account that talk about who he was and what he did. And then I've got another small genealogy table, and then some of the things that are going on in our current culture to suppress human consciousness. Okay, I think that'll cue us up with enough to talk about. So let's get started on awareness, thought, consciousness, and some definitions. Let's see if I can facilitate helping you there. Okay, so we talked about Viktor Frankl briefly. Who was the guy? He was actually a prisoner of war in Nazi Germany in the Holocaust camps. And this guy went through an existence that is hard to imagine, any individual going through the torture that he did. Why is it important? He discovered, through man's search for meaning, how to find freedom in the most extreme circumstances. And other people have found it as well, but he wrote this many, many years ago, and it's been on the New York Times bestseller for many, many years. And what he learned in this book is applicable to all of us in terms of dealing with your external circumstances so that your internal consciousness can overcome it. So to me, it reminds me of the life that we found at the bottom of the ocean that can live where a vent is coming up, extreme temperatures, extreme pressure, yet life can still survive there. Well, the prison camp was similar to that to me, in that he found freedom in a very extreme circumstance, and it's available to all of us. We don't have to be in the extreme circumstance like he was to find it. But there are fundamental questions we all need to know to get on the same page. We need to know who we are and where we came from. It's very important, because if that was common among all of us, we wouldn't be fighting. If we all had the same Genesis account, my God's not bigger than your God, we wouldn't be fighting. So that's very important to me, who we are and where we came from. Okay? What our true creation account is. How were we made? Did we evolve or were we created? Or did both happen? And how we ended up in this current state. If we were created and had overseers, where are they now? Okay. So are they really here and hidden, or are they absent without leave? Or did they abandon us? So we're going to touch on some of those things, and that turns out to be some of the most interesting thing to people for some reason. Let me talk a little bit about my background. I was born in San Diego, and by the time I was 7, my parents moved us to a farm in the northwest corner of Arkansas. So I lived in a very remote farm and didn't know anything a lot about culture. Well, about the time I was 14, I was kicking a ball in my front yard, trying to knock walnuts out of the tree, because we used to get them and put them in the driveway, run over them with a car, and knock the husk off them so you could take them and sell them. So, I don't know if you have walnut trees here, but we did in Arkansas. And about 5 p.m., it was the still of the day, I was kicking that ball up the tree, and about that time I looked up and I saw something across the dirt road where I lived, about 100 feet off the deck, coming north to south, across a cattle field, right across our farm. Silver kind of disc, about the size of a Volkswagen, wasn't making any noise, and I could have thrown a rock and hit it. I had no idea what it was. And it passed over our house very slowly, about 5 to 10 miles an hour, very slow. I went in the house, got my mom, we went on the back porch and looked at this thing coming across our cow pasture. I said, "What is that?" She goes, "I have no idea." And I said, "Well, maybe it's an aircraft going down to Fort Chaffee, some advanced aircraft," and never thought another word about it. Well, later in my life, after I heard about UFOs and such, like, was that what we saw? And so it was an interesting experience. Maybe it prepared me for this kind of path. I'm not sure. I left Arkansas, went back to San Diego. By the time I was 17, a farm boy. And I decided I was going to go to college, because in Arkansas, you either joined the Future Farmers of America and decided to be a farmer, or you were poor. So there wasn't a lot of opportunity. So I went back to San Diego to go to college. And I did, and I finished up at Point Loma High School. And about that time, I got called by a guy to consider going and taking a slot in an aircraft, because my dream as a kid was to fly. And so I left UCSD and Revelle College, and I went in the Army and flew helicopters for 7 years. And it took me all over the world. And I met all kinds of people from various cultures, which was an eye-opener. It was good for me. I got out of the military in '89, out of Manhattan, Kansas, so I've seen snow like this in extreme circumstances. And I went back to San Diego and finished up my engineering degree in electrical engineering. And from there, I worked in the telecom market, broadcast, everything to do with communications. I was involved in it. I was involved in the Global Star Telemetry and Command Unit modem design for a 48 satellite constellation. So I was the lead engineer on that. So I got some real deep knowledge about putting data onto carriers and taking it off. And so when we get into the communication stuff and how it relates to your energy body, you'll see that come out from my electrical engineering background. Okay. From there, I was actually the vice president of engineering at a company called LightPoint Communications. And I was traveling to Turkey, of all places, and they had identified a telecom market that was deregulated, much like what happened in Mexico. And so they wanted to take advantage of this, and they wrote a patent, and they signed me up to help them do this. And what they were going to do was roll out this infrastructure all through Istanbul and all the 225 million Turkish-speaking people in that region. And I was a part of that. And through that process, I thought, you know, I really don't know that much about Turkey and these people, and these were real heavy hitters. And I decided to look into their culture, find something that I could communicate with them. And while I was traveling back and forth to Turkey, I was reading a book by Professor Gerald called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And I understand somebody in here was reading that book. Okay. How far are you in the book?
Chapter 8.
Okay. Have you read about Kala Hayek yet? The obsidian capital in Turkey. Well, so I was kind of on like Scott, I had a little bit of an interest in history, but not much. I was really a technology guy. But I needed to get some nugget that I could share with my clients so they didn't think I was an ugly American. And so reading this book, I learned, well, there's an old city in Turkey. Let me talk to them about that. And one thing led to another as I researched the history of Turkey and realized what I knew about history didn't match with what was really going on in the world. You know, we knew about Egypt that was supposedly 3100 BCE, and it was supposedly one of the oldest building sites on the planet. Well, all of a sudden, here we had Kala Hayek in Turkey that was 9,000 to 12,000 years old. And then recently after that, we discovered Göbekli Tepe that's even older. So I'm getting ahead of myself. But in that process, I became interested in history. And in about 2002, I read a book, and I was thinking about writing a book at this point, looking into ancient technology, transportation, building, and so on. And about this time, I came across the work of Zecharia Sitchin. And how many people have heard of Zecharia Sitchin, by the way? A few people, okay. He was a Hebrew scholar, born in Palestine, born in Russia and lived in Palestine, and he was a reporter and a linguist. And so he spoke Hebrew and many other languages. And somehow he came across a Sumerian account and decided he was going to teach himself to learn to read Sumerian cuneiform. He was one of only 5 to 10 people on this planet that could do that. And so he was one of the early pioneers in converting some of the documents before they digitized them. Okay, so he wrote a book called The 12th Planet in 1978. I read that book, and the theories in it were so fantastic and appealed to my left brain, all my scientific evidence. I needed all the references to make sure this was true. And I was in a corroboration mode for many years after reading that book. And I read that book, and I read all his other books as well. And everybody else that had written a book like on the topic of the Nephilim or anybody related to the Genesis story of these giants or Nephilim that had to do with our creation account. Because remember, from the first bullets we were looking at, we need to know this story so we can get on the same page. Okay, let me see if I can advance now. Oh, it's working. Okay. I thought it was. Oh, so while I was in Arkansas, I have to disclose that I was raised Baptist. And we had a very good understanding of the Bible. I know the tradition we came from, we read it front to back. I mean, we truly knew the Bible. So this helped me a lot in this process of getting all the references. So in my book, you'll see there's a lot of references that corroborate the Sumerian account with the Bible. There's many other books outside the Bible that I referred to, and all the Sumerian documents as well. But the Bible is the one that you find in every hotel room in the Gideons to make sure of that. And I figured we need to address that. So you'll see some references, and I'll talk a lot about that today as well. So from that, I was married for 14 years and went through a shift where my partner was Catholic. And that was really different for me in that I didn't feel the same spirit or power in that organization I did in the other one. So I started comparing and contrasting from a religious standpoint. Not very evolved at that point in my spiritual path, but I was paying attention, and this path made me uncomfortable. In this path, I have to say, putting somebody between me and my Creator made me really uncomfortable. Okay? And it still does today. And we'll talk about that. So I began piecing together the true story of mankind's history after reading the Sumerian records in the year probably 2002, I guess it was. Let's see what I put here. Yeah. And then about 1999, I got thrown a big curveball while I was in this path. My son JJ was born, and he had a genetic disorder called 22q delete, or DeGeorge syndrome. And you're probably asking yourself, well, how does this relate to consciousness and the Anunnaki? Well, JJ had an issue in that his connective tissue was very loose. I'd never seen anything like this. Actually, around his legs, the connective tissue had draped down like a sock, and it was so thick around his ankles he couldn't walk. And it was part of this genetic disorder, DeGeorge syndrome, where the 22nd chromosome has a deletion at the 11th protein marker. Very devastating. There's over 200 symptoms that go with this disorder, the worst of which is congenital heart problems, missing aortic arches, ventricle septal problems, things like that. So he was a real challenge, and it took me off my research path for a while. But little did I know, he was the key to lead me back to where I needed to go. So through this process, I was running triathlons in San Diego, and I was really having problems with my body. I'd used my body very rough, played football, track, baseball, had all kinds of accidents, motorcycles, helicopter accidents, all things. And I was running a triathlon. I was having a lot of problems. I'd just gotten off the bike, and I couldn't even run. Couldn't even run after pedaling the bike so hard. And this guy took off running after getting off the bike, and he looked like an animal. I'd never seen such perfect motion. And I got to the end of the race, and I asked this guy, I said, "Are you a running kinematics doctor or what? Because I've got some real issues I need to work on." And he goes, "No." He goes, "You should check out structural integration." And that's all he said to me, and that was enough. He planted the seed for me. And I went out and thought, well, what is that? And I bought the book as an engineer and read it. Didn't understand any of it. It was almost all physiology and levers and extensors and flexors. You know, I wasn't a physiologist. I didn't understand the stuff. But she had said some things in the opening of her book that really caught my attention. One of which was how your personality could change as a function of your structure changing. I'm like, really? And so she was talking energy, and she got my attention. So I stayed with this, decided to have it done to myself in order to facilitate possibly doing it with my kid. So I did this. And my body started changing in a pretty profound way. And I thought there's real potential here that this could help my kid. Just like Ida Rolf, the founder of structural integration, found that it helped her kid. So her kid had polio and his leg was mangled, and through this process she figured out how to change the body so that he could walk. Okay? So the malleability of the body is what I want you to take away from that. And we'll talk a lot about it. So JJ led me to structural integration, which led me to learning about the body and I ended up having an encounter with someone in Hawaii. And there's a link there to the Anunnaki, and I'll share that. So while I was in Hawaii, I'll go ahead and do it before I get a question. So while I was in Hawaii, I had this structure work done to me, and all of a sudden, I started experiencing some change in my perception, and I didn't understand it as an engineer. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm moving around. I don't know if I'm getting the mic here. Yeah, okay. Well, I was sitting out overlooking this lagoon in Hawaii and thinking to myself, what is human energy? Because I'm experiencing something and I can't put my finger on it. It's changing. The sunlight makes me feel different. The water was making me feel different. What's going on here? And about that time, I started digging into it, and I asked myself, what is human energy? And can we measure it? And about that time, I think one of those potential, like the physics experiment, where if you're involved in the experiment, you're changing it. Well, about that time, I started getting some sort of interaction, and equations started coming to me. And it made sense to me, and I started writing them down. And as part of the requirement for this course, we had to write a graduation paper. And in that paper, I wrote, my topic was structure is function and energy. And that started the whole opening of the connection between the laws of the universe and the laws of this physical reality. When you mix those two, what really opened up for me. And I'm going to share that with you today. Before we get into that real deeply, though, I want to see if there are any questions you have to help guide this discussion. And I want you to feel free to ask questions throughout. And we'll do questions at the end as well, but I don't want this to be just a one-sided informational exchange. First of all, yeah, go ahead, baby. Let's talk about what consciousness is, thoughts, awareness, spirit, and energy. They often get used interchangeably. I would proffer to you to think that possibly spirit and energy are interchangeable. Spirit being the old religious term, and energy being the new physics term. And we'll see this from Webster's definition, but I operate that way, so you'll need to know that that's a premise. Okay, so let's go for it. Consciousness, a term that's used very freely, but hardly ever defined. And it's very hard to define something like this. What is consciousness? The condition of being conscious, the normal state of being awake. Rene Descartes posed the question, am I awake or am I asleep? How do you know? How can you prove the difference? So the idea of consciousness and levels of consciousness and awareness are very, very frontal in this discussion. A person's mind and thoughts. Well, all of a sudden, well, what's that? What's your mind? Is it just your brain? And here's the concept of thought. So now all of a sudden they're throwing these definitions here. We need to go define those too. So we're going to do that. And if there are questions about, just slow me down, okay? I know this is kind of the yucky part of let's get on the same page. And I don't want to do any wordsmithing or redefining anything. So that's why I'm doing this with you, okay? And this is directly from Webster's. So that was the overall definition, but let's look through here. The quality or state of being aware, especially something within oneself. Now, consciousness could be internal or external. And while we're on this topic, I want to define something for you. When I was in a company called Reticular Systems, it was let me turn this up a little bit. It was an artificial research company, and our job was to create a system that understood situation awareness, much like a human does, aware of all the circumstances around you and events or entities that could affect your mission. So we had built a three-dimensional simulator that we would send an aircraft through, and the idea was to make it aware of the environment so that it could survive. And in that process, I learned something about the term interesting. And I'm not sure if I'd put it up here, but the term interesting is one of the most profound terms you could ever define. Attempt to define it for yourself, and you'll see. And I think I did that here in one of these slides. So what we're conscious of is oftentimes something that's interesting to us. That's what I want to talk about. Okay? Let's see if there's anything else useful. Oh, I like this one. The upper level of mental life in which the person is aware is contrasted with unconscious processes. So the idea of consciousness being compared and contrasted in order to understand the levels of it. So we have the concept in psychology of the subconscious and the awakened consciousness. So all of a sudden we're at levels of reality of consciousness. So it gets to be a messy term. I'm going to do it with math. Hopefully I'll make it. And then thoughts. So what is a thought? According to Webster, it's an idea, a plan, a picture, an opinion that's formed in your mind. Something you think of. The act or process of thinking. Well, if thoughts are the basis of belief, because accumulating thoughts together and putting them in some cogent form that create a belief, then the thoughts are really important because they lead to this biology of behavior, as Dr. Bruce Lipton mentioned, right? So thoughts are important. What I don't see here in this further definition is how they describe the origins of thoughts. And that I wanted to add for you. The act or process of thinking, seriously considered. I mean, this is the boilerplate template of what you get from culture about what a thought is. But when you really dig into a thought, it actually has physical manifestation that can be measured in hormones and chemicals in your body, whether it's a positive thought or a negative thought. So the biology of belief, I think, is really profound, and I think it is the next logical step to pursue in this area of consciousness. One thing I want to talk about is that thoughts potentially could be internally generated or externally generated. Now, when I was doing some research in college, we built a system called the bidirectional associative memory. It was a way to model how the human brain comes up with context-based thoughts that are triggered by the environment you're in or some circumstance. And so the idea of seeing something in your environment and go through the visual system, generating a thought that through either a familiarity with the context or externally the thought coming from some other source, but it's usually a somatic trigger that causes the thought to occur.
What is a somatic trigger?
Well, whether it's something you see, touch, or sense. So this idea of being in an environment, looking at objects, associating what they are, and then capturing it into like a token that's stored in your brain is how bidirectional associative memory works. It's very interesting. So what it doesn't take into account is that potentially this trigger could come from outside without you being a part of it. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so this is all kind of textbook definitional stuff on thoughts. But there's one, okay. I want to talk about thoughts and behavior real quick. So imagine however this thought occurs to you, whether it's a thought of it being cold outside or the weight of your wristwatch on your wrist. The idea of awareness and thoughts we're going to talk about in a second. But behavior, I would proffer to you, is nothing more than a belated announcement of a thought you accepted as your own. I don't care where it came from. If the thought was internally generated through some exposure to a context-based bringing up of a memory from bidirectional associative memory or a picture sheet, whatever, wherever the thought came from, once you accept it as your own, it's yours. And eventually, it has the potential to turn into behavior. Right? So what am I telling you? Whether the thought's coming externally or you're generating internally, ultimately, it's the ultimate responsibility is deciding you're going to choose whether that's your thought or not. And that's where the differentiation has to happen for this to really take you to the next level, in my opinion. And I truly believe that your thinking manifests your reality. So if you think negatively, you're going to manifest that, and you're going to attract people around you that are like that. So thinking is very important. Think about it this way. A thought is an electromagnetic signal that can be measured on an EEG. Where's the doctor in here? I lost him. There. Am I right? So if you can measure something with an electroencephalogram, it's electric. Guess what? Electricity through the electromagnetic spectrum travels all through the universe. If you're generating an electromagnetic signal in your body, it can be measured remotely, either from here, possibly even from a satellite if you have a high enough gain antenna. So thoughts are real things. Real things. Okay? Awareness. Let's talk about awareness. So thoughts and awareness and consciousness often get convoluted together. Well, awareness is an interesting thing because it's tied to survival, in my opinion. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So it's an adjective, knowing that something such as a situation, a condition, or a problem exists, like it's snowing real hard and it's dark and whatever, okay? We experienced that last night. It could be a feeling or experience or noticing something, okay? These are all well and good, but I would tell you that there's something fundamentally below this, and it's biological. Now, when I discovered this, why won't that advance it? When I was working at a company called Reticular Activating System, or Reticular Systems. The Reticular Activating System is a biological organ in your brain that helps you choose what's important. Remember we talked about what's interesting. What's interesting is what's important. And what's important is tied to your survival. So now let's go to this aircraft simulator I was telling you about. So if I take an aircraft in the simulator and I'm going to fly it from point A to point B, and I give it the constraint, it's got to make it to point B at a certain time. Okay? It's its mission, okay? Everything that affects that aircraft from going point A to point B on this path is interesting. If I get a tailwind and it accelerates my speed, I'm going to arrive sooner. That's interesting. If there's somebody on the hill with a surface air missile that could potentially have the range that could knock me out of the sky, that's really interesting because it affects my survival. So I would tell each of you, you have a life path and a plan that takes you from point A to point B. And everything that's interesting along that path has to do with you accomplishing that mission and surviving. And it's done at a very fundamental level in your DNA. And it has to do with the archetypes, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? So let's move on to the definition of spirit. Am I going too fast? Is everybody with me? Okay.
Actually, I didn't understand what you said.
Neither did I just said it.
Are you saying, when you say it's wired to our DNA,
Yeah,
you're saying that it's hey, this is, part of our DNA, and if it's going to happen, it's going to happen.
Well,
it's just a thing that you have to go down.
That's a good question. Let me tie that into the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system is a biological organ in you that will help you prioritize what's important. So for instance, you're not aware of areas on your body until somebody touches you. And they're, oh, I got a somatic sensation right there. Now I'm aware of that. Or you weren't aware of the weight of your wristwatch on your wrist until I just told you about it. So I just brought your awareness through your reticular activating system to something that's happening to you. Well, that reticular activating system is very focused on your survival. Okay, so you can't be aware of everything that's going on at one time. It's impossible. Imagine all the functions going on in your body simultaneously. The only one you're probably aware of that's in your body is something that maybe hurt or something. It's going to bring your awareness to the highest priority issue that's going on. And then once that one's resolved, guess what? It's going to focus on the next one and the next one. And there's always issues to focus on. Okay? So the reticular activating system is very important in terms of awareness and focus of attention. And that was the key to us building situational awareness in this aircraft model, is understanding how that works. Okay? So, next time you use the term interesting, think about that. Because what's interesting to you has the potential to change your state space on your path. I just want you to know that in spirit, look at what shows up in here. Energy and power. Right? These are modern physics terms that they're using this old definition. And so when I talk about spirit and energy, this is why I use them almost interchangeably. Okay? I like the term energy because you can put numbers on it and quantify it. Okay? So let's get the full-blown, an animating or vital principle held to give life physical organisms. So this is interesting to me because the people who have gone after the energy that animates all matter have usually end up in prison or everything. You're shaking your head. You know who I'm talking about, don't you? Wilhelm Reich was one of them. He discovered an energy that animated humans, and he called it the orgone bioenergy. All his stuff was confiscated, and his books were burned, and he died in prison for talking about this kind of stuff. So, where energy meets this matter has always been off limits for a good reason, because it has to do with consciousness and awareness. You can't be a good slave if you're a conscious being and realize you're enslaved. Right? So, okay, so I won't go through all this, but the reason I brought the spirit definition up, I wanted you to see about the connection between power. Oh, look, here's one. A supernatural being or essence as a capitalized Holy Spirit. So, so the idea of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, very powerful in our culture, and we want to talk about that. Okay, I don't think there's anything else up there that I want. Oh, here, this one. The immaterial, intelligent, or sentient part of a person. Immaterial. I guess energy is immaterial. So Webster made an attempt at this, but I don't think he did it justice. There it goes. I got to point this thing a certain way. Okay. It seems like a big jump to go into defining structural integration, but I think it's very important as it relates to these other principles. So what is it? It was a manipulative form of therapeutic body work, which in a sequential process would soften up the connective tissue body, which helps the individual relate to the gravity field. So what? So your posture gets a little better. Who cares, right? Well, this is profound, what this does. So Ida Rolf coined this term called the 10 series as it relates to structural integration. And this brings up the question, what is gravity? So if you're going to try and relate your bodies to some force field called gravity, what is gravity? And why would we want to do such a thing? Well, what we notice is that there are lines and planes in the body. Whoever architected us to be in alignment with gravity. And it's very important. So gravity has been treated as a principle like the tetherball theory, where you got two planets, and this one, because of its size, and has an effect on the smaller one and keeps it in its orbit. Well, we've been able to prove that that's been wrong for many, many years, but this is still being taught in college today. So the idea that gravity is an attractive force is actually wrong. Okay? Has anybody read anything else on gravity? Does anybody have any concepts or alternative definitions of what's being proffered as the proper definition of gravity?
Relativity.
No? Relativity.
Relativity.
Okay, Einstein. He wrote some stuff on it. But this is a very powerful force that we encounter every single day. One of the most powerful ones, and we don't even talk about it. We don't teach our children about it at all. They get in diapers and they stand up for the first time and start walking, and whatever pattern is in their body, that's the one they get to keep unless it's been changed by a structural integrator their whole life. So it's very, very profound how gravity and the relationship to the body, and I'm going to show you that in the equations. So changing the fascial state. And what is the fascia? This is the white tissue that they usually remove on the superficial layer right underneath the skin so they can see the organs and all the muscles. And they've treated it as junk tissue that's dead because they didn't seem to be serving any purpose. Turns out that the connective tissue body is very important. in that if you were to take an orange and slice it open, you'd see the meat of the orange inside with the little sacs that give it its structure. Well, those little structural components are like the fascia in your body. They give it the shape. Okay? So Ida Rolf, in her process of figuring out how to help her kid, figured out how to change the state of connective tissue to soften it. And if you do that, it has very profound implications relative to energy. And that's what I want to share. So this malleability, imagine that there were lines in the planes in the body. And let's just pick one that's easy to relate. If you were to look at a human and look at their ear, their shoulder, their hip, their knee, and the lateral malleoli of their ankle, those should be in a complete line with a plumb bob hanging from a roof, if you're aligned with a gravity field that's orthogonal to the Earth. Okay? So if you're standing up straight and those are aligned, you're lined up with the gravity field according to what Ida Rolf said. And we have grid charts and plumb bobs as structural integrators. That's what we do. Okay? And many athletes have learned about this work since the 60s when it was released. Okay? Seems very foreign to be talking about this related to consciousness. But let me tell you, if you do that and you see these equations that I'm going to talk about, there's nothing more powerful that you can do to a human structure than align it with the gravity field and what it does to consciousness. Whoops, did I go too fast? There was one more there. Now, gravity is a significant variable in the derived human energy equation in Chapter 6 of my book. And I think it forms a fundamental basis for this quantized consciousness that I'm going to talk about. And I've never seen this published anywhere else. Okay? So let me talk a little bit about gravity for you. We've been taught that when you hold something up and drop it, that a force field is pulling it down to the Earth, right? I mean, it looks like the obvious solution of what gravity is. It's a force that's pulling you down to the Earth. Okay? The reality is, we know from physics that all matter is expanding. And we can see this through the universe. And we can measure it with various techniques to determine the extent that it's expanding. Okay? Well, if all matter is expanding, and we're matter, guess what? You're expanding at the same rate all other matter is expanding. So now let's build a model for you to understand. Imagine the Earth is a very large beach ball that can be inflated. And you are a very small rubber ball sitting on top of the beach ball, right on top of it, okay? So here's the big ball, and here's the little ball sitting on top, and they can both be inflated at the same rate. Okay, so we're putting air in them at the same rate. The large beach ball, since it's so much larger in surface area, is going to exert a pressure on the small one, okay? So the small one's going to feel the big one pushing it up. Are you with me? The analogy is being in an elevator, and the elevator is taking you up, and you feel like you're being pushed down, right? It's exactly the same sensation. That's how gravity is operating. Now, why is that important? We think that gravity is pushing us down and compressing us and making us go wide and destructured. That's not true. By not being aligned with the gravity field and pushing into the Earth, you've got to push down to go up. And that's one of the secret principles of structural integration. Okay? Very, very interesting. There's a ground resonant force that you've got to push down to go up. And it's because of the proper definition of gravity. And you'll learn that. This is kind of an advanced topic in structure work. But once you realize that, you'll find yourself going barefoot, trying to find your inner and lateral arches, and truly dissipating your weight correctly into the ground. And we'll talk about that. Questions about gravity, structural integration, and the energy body? Any questions? I know this is kind of probably foreign to you. How many people have heard of structural integration or Rolfing? You have? Okay. Just a couple.
How did it help your son?
Well, when I came back after learning to do this work, within a few months, and I photographed and did the plumb bob and the grid chart so you could see how he was standing. Within a few months, I got the braces off his legs. He was jumping on a trampoline and had better balance than any kid in his class. And still to this day, that's the case. He's very, very flexible now because of it.
So you expanded the fascia to
Well, basically,
soft tissue?
we essentially, through structural integration, there's a process of using temperature, tension, pressure, and sometimes frequency in a more advanced situation where you can change the state of connective tissue. And this is what Ida Rolf learned to do for her kid and wrote a book about it.
Say those again, temperature?
Temperature, pressure, tension, and frequency. So if you put your elbow on something and push down, you get some pressure. If you start moving it, you stretch it, that's tension, just like yoga. And then you add some temperature to that. Those three in combination, at the right integration speed, has to be done very slowly. The connective tissue does not like fast movement. If you end up in a car accident, go over 25 miles an hour, and there's an impact, your connective tissue can be damaged. You could get a whiplash injury. Well, how does that happen? Anybody ever think about how in an instant you could suddenly end up with a pattern in your body from an impact? Anybody know how that happens? It's very devastating too. Has anybody ever had a whiplash accident in a car? Been hit by, yeah. You know what it's like, right? And it's invisible in the sense that you don't see the damage, but you truly feel it all inside through your organs. Well, what happens? The nervous system has two components, the sympathetic and the autonomic. If the sympathetic nervous system cannot control tissue in your body, it gets given over to the autonomic system and it goes to sleep. That's devastating to know that. Imagine all the tissue you're born with around the crest of your ilium that may be up to an inch thick that you've never controlled. How could you possibly have a free and mobile pelvis with that? It's not possible. Okay? So temperature, tension, pressure, and frequency. And frequency is the least known one. And it's just now coming out the extent to which frequency can change the state of things. And I believe it was a gentleman sitting back, I don't know if he's there, he asked about that, and we were going to talk about it. And it has to do with cymatics and frequency and vibrational medicine that came from Ayurvedics. Okay. One of the things that structural integration does to the body, which is really profound, is it changes this connective tissue such that, and the connective tissue envelops everything, okay? There's a superficial layer of it like a wetsuit right underneath your skin. Then it interdigitates deep into your body. It envelops every muscle, every bone. All this connective tissue is made of collagen, okay? And collagen can be woven in fibers to be like ligaments. It can be put down as bandages if you have a joint that's misaligned, and it can shore it up and make it stronger. Well, these collagen band-aids can very much affect your structure where you could never find the ability to stand up straight. Okay? And you can't control those because they're controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Now, structural integration is a process where you work with the client, not on them, you work with them. And essentially, through this process, you wake up all the connective tissue in their body.
So is this something that you do, like, in the privacy of your own home? Or
Yeah.
are there people
Yeah.
who don't go to a therapist?
Well, actually, once you get and understand these principles, there's a large part of it you can do for yourself. Yeah. There's certain things that have you by the back of the neck that you don't know that you will never be able to get unless somebody helps you with it. Truly, it's like that.
Aren't they called Rolfers?
They used to call it Rolfing until the International Association of Structural Integration came along and said, you know, that term, because of the old samurai Rolfers that used rocks or sticks or anything that changed the state of the body, they affiliated it with painful massage. And they didn't want that anymore. So the new modern word is structural integration. And it's applied in a way where it's not painful. No client should be in pain when they're receiving this work. But that's not the history of the understanding of it, okay? So one other thing that's really interesting to me, and I've measured this, structural integration can change the distance between your vertebrae. Okay, so imagine these vertebrae all stacked together and you soften up the connective tissue and all of a sudden they can start moving like a chain. And your head being the last vertebra, a ball on the end of the chain. Imagine it could, have you ever seen those toys in the store you can pick up like a snake and it goes like this and it just wiggles? That's how your spine is supposed to work. Okay? So imagine what happens if you change the spine and the spacing in between those vertebrae and assume that this model of the electrical energy body is true, where you have nerve ganglia along your central conductor. Now all of a sudden you just change the spacing in between those with this work. Very profound. Because I would proffer to you, and I'm going to go over this, that wavelength really matters. And wavelength is a function of distance between nodes. Okay. Questions?
How about inversion therapy versus SF?
Well, because of the definition of gravity, and I have had an inversion table with gravity boots for many years, you will not get the same effect as you will when you find gravity and push down to go up versus hanging. Hanging is wonderful for decompression. And if you do it in the right way, you can actually change your connective tissue. So we can talk about that if you want. Okay. Now, the other thing about structural integration that's so important in understanding gravity is your center of gravity, your balance, lands right in the soft bowl of your pelvis while you're standing. Okay? So, changing the horizontality of the pelvis was the key to structural integration for Ida Rolf. Okay? The reason that is because there are proprioceptors on the back of your cranium that reference that point in your pelvis in order to know whether you're vertical or not. So if your head's not on right, you got damage to your neck, or your pelvis is contorted, there's no possible way you'll be able to stand, relate yourself to the ground, and be vertical. And you'll see this from grid charts. Every client that I've taken pictures of, you'd think their head was put on and thrown on from across the room when you look at the grid chart. It's unbelievable what gravity does. And it's probably been like that if they hadn't had major accidents since they were born. So you don't come out well-formed when you're born, and it's a pretty traumatic process. And we don't truly understand why our connective tissue is all glued to everything at birth. It's glued to muscles, it's glued to itself. It's a mess. Ida Rolf used to refer to humans as disorganized bodies when they would show up. Every one of them. And unless you've had this kind of work, it's true for all of us. You'll find. So, changing the horizontality of pelvis, very, very important. Now, what does that mean? If you have the legs coming into the pelvis and the torso coming into the pelvis from the top, she treated the body as 7 segments. Okay? The feet, the legs, the upper leg, lower leg, the pelvis, the torso, the neck, and the head. And she treated them as rocks that could be stacked on top of each other. And you know if you don't stack rocks straight on top of each other, if one's out of place down here, you've got to do the opposite on the top to get them to balance. Well, the human body is no different. Okay? It's a 3-dimensional web of rocks connected by rubber bands and popsicle sticks. Okay? And if it's 3-dimensional web, they have a name for this model, where they model you that way. But it's true. Now imagine you got rubber bands connecting on this side, and this one is glued to something, and this one's not, and you're like this. And you're not even aware of it, because it's controlled by the autonomic nervous system, and it's got you. That's how the body is. Okay? Can you click me? Okay. Now, in the human body, it's modeled as an electrical system. Okay, in my model. Of course, I'm an electrical engineer, so that's how I would treat the body. But it's true. Okay. Think about a lightning rod that you put in the ground. And I'm sure you get good storms out here. You got to have a lightning rod. Well, what does it do? The ground is the lowest energy potential in an electrical system. The top of the antenna, or the pole that you stick in the ground, is going to reach a different polarity than the ground. Right? It's going to be putting off positive ions, because the negative one is at the ground potential. Well, when it does that, it's going to attract positive ions from the cloud, and that's why the lightning will strike it and dissipate that energy into the ground. Well, in our bodies, we have a positive and a negative pole as well, along this electrical system that we have. We have the electrical central conductor of our spine. Along that spine, we have nerves that come into masses that then innervate out for sensing and affecting. And they call them ganglions, which is a nerve complex. Well, in the East, they call them chakras. Okay? Now, has everybody heard of a chakra? Okay. It's kind of ever since yoga came to this country, everybody knows what it is. But what I term chakras as is here we are. Okay. So in the chakras, and some people model it as 7, some people as 9. I typically adopt the number of 7. And these energy ganglia, these nerve ganglia, map to physical portions in your body. And I'm just going to talk about the positive and the negative one right now, and then we'll see pictures later. In structural integration work, we oftentimes deal with the coccyx bone, which is the bottom of the sacrum, the sacred bone. And it's almost always deviated. Okay? If you've got something that can move in your body, like the xiphoid process, a little finger bone here, the little finger bones here, okay? If you've got stuff that can move and isn't tethered, it's going to get in trouble, including your tailbone. As a matter of fact, over the almost 10 years I did structural work, I didn't have one client that I know of who didn't have a tailbone that was deviated. from snowboarding or falling down in diapers, learning to walk, whatever the reason was. Why is that important? The ganglion of empire, your negative pole of your energy body, sits on your tailbone. Okay? So if there's deviation down there, there's a good possibility you're standing on the earth like that antenna we talked about. And your feet are touching the ground, but your negative pole of your energy body is not at the ground potential because you've got problems there. Well, now think about an antenna that doesn't work well as a lightning rod. Now you've got problems. Okay? The positive part of that pole, I get ahead of myself. Oh, yeah. Now, okay, let me do this one, it's important. Most are deviated from an impact. Okay? And structural integration, by changing this connective tissue, that's one of the most important areas to get awake. And also, the free and mobile pelvis was a very important model out of Rolf as well. So this ganglion of empire, this negative pole that sits right here, is the place that's often represented as a coiled snake where the Kundalini energy rises, if anybody's heard of that. Has anybody heard of that? Yeah. Well, there's a physical reason for that, because that ganglion has, in this electrical pole, positive, negative pole, can very much be activated, because you are an antenna. So if you treat yourself an antenna and realize this, it can be very powerful energetically. Now, the reason I bring that up is in the Bible, John 1:12, it says, "To all who receive him, to them gave he power." Where does that power go? In our electrical energy system right here, to become the sons of God, whatever that means. Right? So keep that in mind. That's why I went through these definitions of power and spirit, because all of a sudden you see in the physical body, where we interact with this electromagnetic spectrum, there is an interchange, and this is where it happens, at the negative pole of your energy body. Where's the positive pole? Did I have that up here? No, okay. Maybe I didn't. The positive pole...
Are you saying that lower ganglion is the capacitive region?
That's right. Capacitive, that's a good term to use for storing this energy in a way. Now, there are processes and sequences that people talk about for releasing this energy. Okay? I'm not going to go too much into that. I would tell you that getting your body related to the gravity field through structural integration will definitely release it. Every client I've ever had, it did.
I've seen people force it with fire breath or whatever.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about breath. You can mess with your breath and change your consciousness for an instant, and you stop doing it and you go back to where you were. You change your body in alignment with the gravity field, not only does it start changing your perception, your personality, and your sense of energy, it doesn't stop. As long as you play the game of going, well, my head's like a bowling ball, and I got to keep it on top of this thing, or those rocks aren't going to align, right? Like we talked about the 7 segments. You keep playing that game, and you'll continue integrating with gravity until the point where you're aligned with it. Just play that game. It's very powerful.
Why do we care to be aligned with gravity? What's the big deal?
Well, the reason is, and we're going to get to this, is if you want to maximize your consciousness, I'm going to show you the equation why gravity is integral in that. Okay?